Welcome back, friends. In our last discussion, there were three topics that we ended on and which we said we would discuss further. The first topic is on secularism. That India can be or has the basis for becoming a secular state. Now, what does it mean to say secularism in India? What they actually say is that the Indian government, or rather the Indian state, to be more precise, should maintain equal distance from all religions. Now, this is a very far cry from secularism as it was originally conceived in Europe. And as you may know, secularism was conceived, developed, and refined in Europe over a long period. It begins with the begins with the 30-year war between Catholics and Protestants, leading to the Peace of Westphalia. And under the treaty, the Pope was ejected from political decisions in countries. And countries were declared to be sovereign and not under the Pope. It was the first step towards a secular society. The next step was the French Revolution. The next major step, rather, was the French Revolution, where they adopted the rights of man and the citizen in 1789. And there again, they emphasized the importance of the church being separate from the state. Now, what did this separation of state concretely mean? It means that the laws of the state shall not be defined by religion. In other words, the movement for secularism separated canon law, that is church law, religious law, from common law. And it was this separation that was promoted by the Enlightenment, by the French Revolution, and then finally it was enshrined in the 1905 French law on the separation of state and church. So you can see it took a long time from the 1640s to 1905 for this idea to crystallize. And I'm going into it in some details because in the Indian context, there continues to be some confusion as to what exactly secularism means. And when there's confusion, it is good to go back to the origin of the idea. And as I said, in 1905, finally, this law was brought in France to separate church and state. Now, this did not happen simply in a social vacuum. It did not happen merely because Voltaire in France or John Locke came up with the idea of individual liberty. In a historical sense, one has to see these individual theoreticians as championing the interest of a class to which they belong. And that class was the emerging mercantile class, which was gradually evolving into a capitalist form of economy. And this mercantile class was hampered by the oppressive state oppressive church institutions. And at that time, you may remember that the church in Europe was the largest landowner. And for these emerging mercantilists and their theoreticians, it was necessary to break the power of the church. And one way they did was to confiscate the lands of the church, which happened both in France as well as in England. In England under Henry VIII. Not only did they confiscate the land, but they also decreed that laws of the state shall be based on common law. So in that sense, they not only took away the economic power of the Catholic Church, but also they reduced the political power of the church to make laws. And it was this dynamic between the emerging mercantile class and the oppressive Catholic Church, which was feudal and the biggest landowner. It was this dynamic, some would call it a dialectic, between these two opposing forces that threw up the idea of secularism. That is to say, the administration of the state should not be influenced or determined by the church. Now in India, Nehru imported this idea of a secular state in the 1940s. Perhaps he mentioned it a few years earlier, but it was in the early 1940s that he began to systematically espouse secularism. And he imported the concept to deal with a particular problem that the Indian national movement was facing in India. There was increasing fear, and for good reason, that the British colonial regime would actually undermine the freedom movement by playing Muslims against Hindus. And in fact, there's a well-known maneuver by the British politicians who, when confronted with the demand for independence of British India, they said, which India should we give independence to? Is it the Muslim India or the Hindu India? So, faced with this difficulty, I think quite logically, although not very wisely, Nehru imported secularism. And what that simply meant is that the Congress party will treat both Muslims, Hindus and other religious groups equally and fairly. And that the new state that was emerging, the independent state, will remain secular in the sense of being equidistant from all religions. Now, how did this pan out against the RSS and the Hindutva movement? The Hindutva movement, of course, rejected this idea of there can be something secular and that there was any need for Hindu-Muslim unity. What they argued, the Hindutva movement, was that India has always been a Hindu state. And here again, like the Congress historians, which we mentioned last time, the RSS historians also viewed India as a united political formation going back thousands of years. And they actually imposed that notion of history on the Republic of India, which became independent in 1947. In the process, they also made the same mistake that the Congress historians made. That is to say, how India, that is the state of India, that is the British India as a state, has an ancient history. And the Hindutva group argued, yes, it has an ancient history, but has a Hindu history. Now, in the midst of all this, what was missed are two or more than two elementary facts. That one, India was confused with India, the Republic. India, the region, yes, it is antiquity, but India, the Republic, is very young. But by discussing the history of India, these historians rarely specify that they are referring to India, the region. Instead, they let it slide, I would say rather sloppily, into India, the Republic. So suddenly, at 1948, we had historians in India claiming that India, the Republic, had an ancient history. Now, this argument fell apart as what we call regional histories began to assert themselves. What they mean by regional histories are histories of historical nations, which are otherwise called politico-cultural zones. And these semantic acrobatics is used to avoid calling the historical societies and cultures as nations. Now, as I said, this has been part of the difficulty in trying to build or convert an empire into a nation state. And having discussed secularism and the fact that secularism, meaning the state being equidistant from each and every religion, of course, has failed. It has failed because the historians can claim that India is a secular state, but the fact remains that that state has to be manned by a majority of Hindus. And when it is manned by the majority of Hindus, by definition and practice, the state becomes a Hindu state. And this is something that RSS and subsequently the BJP have used to discredit the Congress historians, as we call them. As a result, what we have is that within the space of about 2 decades, let's say from 2014 up till now, the BJP government has completely overturned the secular history or the secular character of the Indian state and have unabashedly declared that today it remains a Hindu state. And this debate between the two sections are going on, and we'll follow it later in the next installment by looking into the so-called Hindu history of India. Thank you for being here. I hope we'll meet again soon. Please like and subscribe, and goodbye for now.